The waves crashed against the steel hull of the landing craft. As Lieutenant Colonel James Earl Rudder gripped the rail, his knuckles white against the metal. It was 3:30 in the morning. On June 6, 1944, and the English Channel had become a highway of death. Around him, the largest amphibious invasion force in human history moved through the darkness toward the fortified coast of Nazi-occupied France. Rudder commanded the 2nd Ranger Battalion, tasked with one of the most dangerous missions of Operation Overlord, scaling the 100-foot cliffs of Point du Hoc to destroy German artillery positions that could devastate the landing beaches. As referenced in Stephen Ambrose's comprehensive work D-Day, June 6, 1944, the Rangers knew their mission was nearly suicidal, but the success of the entire invasion depended on silencing those guns. Supreme Allied Commander General Dwight David Eisenhower had made the most momentous decision of the war just hours earlier. The weather had been atrocious for days, with storm clouds and rough seas threatening to postpone the invasion indefinitely, but his chief meteorologist, Group Captain James Martin Stagg, had spotted a brief window of improvement. Eisenhower gathered his senior commanders in the library of Southwick House near Portsmouth and delivered the fateful words, "Okay, let's go." The decision had not come easily. Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery, commanding all ground forces for the invasion, had argued for delay. Air Chief Marshal Sir Trafford Lee Mallory worried that the paratroopers would be slaughtered. Admiral Sir Bertram Home Ramsay, responsible for the naval forces, expressed concerns about the rough seas. But Eisenhower understood that postponement might mean waiting weeks for another suitable tide, giving the Germans more time to strengthen their Atlantic wall defenses across the Channel. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the desert fox now tasked with defending Hitler's fortress Europe, was ironically absent from his command post, convinced that the Allies would not attack in such weather. He had traveled to Germany to celebrate his wife's birthday and to plead with Hitler for more panzer divisions. The German High Command had fallen victim to their own meteorological miscalculations, believing the storm would prevent any invasion attempt for days. As dawn approached, the massive Allied armada spread across 50 miles of choppy waters. Over 5,000 ships carried more than 150,000 troops toward 5 landing beaches codenamed Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. Above them, nearly 700 warships prepared to unleash the largest naval bombardment in history, while overhead, 13,000 aircraft provided air cover and support. The deception operation, codenamed Fortitude, had worked brilliantly. The Germans remained convinced that the main invasion would come at Pas de Calais, where the English Channel was narrowest. An entire phantom army, complete with inflatable tanks and fake radio traffic, had convinced German intelligence that General George Smith Patton Jr. was preparing to lead the real invasion elsewhere. Meanwhile, the actual invasion force approached the less heavily defended Normandy beaches. In the pre-dawn darkness, 3 divisions of paratroopers had already begun dropping behind enemy lines. The 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions scattered across the Cotentin Peninsula, while British and Canadian paratroopers secured vital bridges and crossroads. Many had been dropped miles from their intended targets due to anti-aircraft fire and pilot error, but their scattered presence actually confused German defenders about Allied intentions. As the first rays of sunlight pierced the storm clouds, the greatest gamble in military history was about to begin. The pre-dawn bombardment began at 5:50 in the morning with a thunderclap that shook the Norman coast. The battleships Nevada, Texas, and Arkansas, veterans of Pearl Harbor, hurled their massive shells toward German positions with methodical precision. Their 14 and 16-inch guns, each shell weighing as much as a small automobile, crashed into concrete bunkers and gun emplacements that had taken the Germans for years to construct. Aboard the command ship Augusta, Lieutenant General Omar Nelson Bradley watched the bombardment through his binoculars, knowing that everything depended on suppressing the German defenses long enough for his First Army to establish a foothold. The Omaha Beach sector, stretching from Vierville-sur-Mer to Colville-sur-Mer, represented the most heavily fortified section of the landing zone. Intelligence reports indicated that the German 352nd Infantry Division, a battle-hardened unit recently moved from the Eastern Front, had transformed the area into a killing field. The naval bombardment, while impressive in its scale, lasted only 35 minutes, far shorter than many commanders had requested. Admiral John Leslie Hall, Jr., commanding the Omaha Beach Naval Forces, had argued for a longer preparation. but the need to maintain surprise and the limited availability of ammunition had forced a compromise that would prove costly. As the guns fell silent, the first wave of landing craft approached the beaches. The D.D. Sherman tanks, equipped with inflatable canvas screens to make them amphibious, struggled through the rough seas. Many sank before reaching shore, their crews trapped inside the steel coffins as the modified tanks disappeared beneath the waves. Of the 30 D.D. tanks launched for Omaha Beach, only 5 would make it to the sand. Major General Leonard Townsend Jarrow, commanding the 5th Corps' assault, had meticulously planned the landing sequence. The first wave would consist of 8 companies from the 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions. Supported by engineers and demolition teams, their mission was to clear obstacles, establish beachheads, and signal for the follow-up waves. What they encountered instead was a hurricane of steel. The German defenders, commanded by General Lieutenant Dietrich Krase, had weathered the bombardment in their deep bunkers and emerged as the naval fire lifted. The concrete casemates built into the cliffs overlooking the beach had survived virtually intact. As the landing craft approached, German machine gunners took their positions behind MG-42 machine guns, capable of firing 1,200 rounds per minute. Company 8 of the 116th Infantry Regiment, mostly men from the small towns of Virginia, hit the beach at 6:30. Within minutes, the unit had ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. Captain Taylor Fellers, wounded in both legs, watched his men cut down as they stumbled through the surf. The carefully planned assault dissolved into chaos as men sought whatever cover they could find behind the steel obstacles and dead bodies of their comrades. The beaches had been transformed into vast minefields. Rommel's asparagus wooden stakes, top of mines dotted the sand along with Belgian gates, Czech hedgehogs, and thousands of individual mines. The rising tide that was supposed to help the landing craft reach shore instead pushed them into this deadly maze of obstacles. Colonel Charles Canham of the 116th Infantry, his right hand mangled by shrapnel, rallied his surviving men with the words that would become legend. "They're murdering us here. Let's move inland and get murdered." His dark humor captured the desperate situation facing the entire Omaha Beach assault. By 7 in the morning, the invasion teetered on the brink of disaster, with follow-up waves refusing to land on what appeared to be a beach strewn with American dead. At 7:15 in the morning, Brigadier General Norman Daniel Code awaited, ashore through the surf at Omaha Beach, his aide clutching a waterlogged radio. The 51-year-old assistant division commander of the 29th Infantry Division surveyed a scene that resembled Danny's Inferno more than a military operation. Bodies floated in the surf while wounded men cried for medics who couldn't reach them through the withering machine gun fire. The initial assault had failed catastrophically. Of the 2,400 men in the first wave, over 1,000 were already casualties. Equipment lay scattered across the beach, radios waterlogged and useless, vehicles burning, and medical supplies contaminated by seawater and blood. The carefully orchestrated timetable that had taken months to plan had disintegrated within the first hour. General Bradley, monitoring the situation from 12 miles offshore, faced the most agonizing decision of his career. Reports from Omaha were fragmentary and contradictory, but all painted the same picture: disaster. His staff urged him to consider evacuating the surviving forces and redirecting them to the more successful Utah Beach or the British sectors. The cost of failure was not just tactical. It could mean the collapse of the entire Western Front strategy. What Bradley and his staff couldn't see from their distant command ship was the individual acts of heroism that were slowly turning the tide. Colonel George Arthur Taylor of the 16th Infantry Regiment, finding his men pinned down in the shingle, delivered the harsh truth that would galvanize the survivors. Two kinds of people are staying on this beach: the dead and those who are going to die. Now let's get the hell out of here. The breakthrough came not from grand strategy, but from small unit leadership and desperate courage. Staff Sergeant Philip Strechik discovered a weakness in the German defenses: a narrow draw between heavily fortified positions that could be infiltrated if men were willing to crawl through a minefield. Under direct observation, leading a handful of volunteers from Company G, 2nd Battalion, 16th Infantry, Strechik began the slow, deadly advance that would crack open the German defensive line. Meanwhile, at Point Du Hoc, Lieutenant Colonel Rudder's Rangers had achieved the impossible, using rocket-fired ropes and extension ladders borrowed from the London Fire Brigade. They had scaled the vertical cliffs under enemy fire, But upon reaching the gun positions, they discovered that the massive artillery pieces were wooden decoys. The real guns had been moved inland, hidden in an apple orchard, where a small Ranger patrol would later destroy them with thermite grenades. The naval gunfire support, initially ineffective due to concerns about hitting American troops, finally found its mark when destroyer skippers brought their ships perilously close to shore. The USS McCook, commanded by Commander Ralph Ramey, steamed to within 800 yards of the beach, so close that German machine gunners were firing at the bridge. The destroyer's 5-inch guns began systematically destroying the concrete emplacements that had held up the advance for hours. By 9 o'clock, small groups of Americans had begun to advance beyond the beach obstacles. Captain Joe Dawson of Company G, 16th Infantry, led the first organized unit to reach the bluffs overlooking Omaha Beach. His company, reduced to 42 men from its original strength of 193, had climbed the seemingly impossible cliffs through sheer determination and the covering fire of the destroyers offshore. The German defense, while initially devastating, began to crack under the relentless pressure. The 352nd Infantry Division, spread across the wider front, couldn't reinforce their threatened positions quickly enough. Moreover, the scattered airborne landings behind their lines had created confusion about Allied intentions, preventing the commitment of reserve forces. That might have thrown the Americans back into the sea. As the morning progressed, the beach, that had seemed like a death trap, began to transform into a functioning supply base, though at a cost that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. As the sun climbed higher on June 6th, the character of the battle began to shift from desperate survival to methodical advance. By 10:30 in the morning, Brigadier General Cota had established a temporary command post in a shell crater, barely 50 yards from the waterline. Using a combination of hand signals, runners, and a few working radios, he began to coordinate the scattered American units that had fought their way off the killing ground of Omaha Beach. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Technical Sergeant Philip Strechik, the mill worker from Pittsburgh who had led the first successful infiltration through the German lines, had been joined by men from different units who had become separated from their original companies. This ad hoc force, numbering fewer than 30 men, had managed to outflank the WN-72 strong point that had been decimating the 4th Infantry Division's advance. Colonel Charles Canham, despite his wounded hand, had reorganized the remnants of the 116th Infantry Regiment into assault teams that moved from crater to crater, using captured German weapons when their own ammunition ran low. The Virginia National Guardsmen, many of whom had never seen combat before dawn that morning, displayed a tenacity that surprised even their officers. The German response was hampered by a command structure that had been paralyzed by Hitler's insistence on personal control over armored reserves. General der Artillerie Erich Marx, commanding the 84th Corps responsible for the Normandy sector, had been requesting permission to commit his panzer reserves since the first paratrooper landing 6 hours earlier. But the Führer was still asleep at his mountain retreat in Berchtesgaden, and none of his subordinates dared wake him with news of the invasion. Oberst Gunther Kiel, commanding the 916th Grenadier Regiment holding the Omaha sector, watched his carefully prepared defenses crumble as individual strong points fell to small unit actions that his operational doctrine had never anticipated. The rigid German defensive plan, which assumed that any landing would either succeed completely or fail catastrophically, had no provision for the grinding, incremental warfare that the Americans were waging. By noon, elements of the 5th Ranger Battalion had linked up with Rudder's surviving Rangers at Point du Hoc, establishing the first continuous American line between Utah and Omaha beaches. The cost had been enormous. Rudder could account for only 42 of his original 225 Rangers, but the strategic objective had been achieved. The German artillery threat to the landing beaches had been neutralized. The logistical miracle that made the continued advance possible was largely invisible to the fighting men. Despite the initial chaos, the beach masters and their teams had begun organizing the flow of supplies across what had been a battlefield hours earlier. LST's landing ship tank ground their bows into the sand to disgorge trucks, ammunition, and medical supplies while under intermittent artillery fire from German positions that had not yet been silenced. Major General Charles Hunter Gerhardt, commanding the 29th Infantry Division, came ashore at 1 o'clock in the afternoon to find his division scattered across 6 miles of coastline, but still advancing. His men had learned hard lessons in the morning's fighting. German strong points had to be bypassed and reduced individually. Naval gunfire was essential for cracking concrete fortifications, and small unit leadership was more important than elaborate tactical plans. The afternoon brought the first signs that the invasion had achieved strategic, as well as tactical success. German radio intercepts revealed increasing confusion in enemy headquarters as reports flooded in of additional landings at Gold, Juno, and Sword Beaches. The 21st Panzer Division, the only armored reserve immediately available to counterattack the landings, had been committed piecemeal and was being ground down by superior Allied air power and naval gunfire. As evening approached on the longest day, American forces had advanced nearly 2 miles inland from Omaha Beach, establishing a foothold that, while precarious, could not be easily dislodged. The price paid for this achievement would be calculated later. 2,400 American casualties on Omaha Beach alone, with many units suffering losses exceeding 50%, while the Americans struggled through their baptism of fire. At Omaha and Utah, the British and Canadian forces faced their own crucible on the eastern beaches of Normandy. At Gold Beach, the 50th Northumbrian Division, commanded by Major General Douglas Alexander Graham, encountered a different but equally deadly reception from the German defenders. The 22nd Dragoon Guards, equipped with D.D. Sherman tanks, had better luck than their American counterparts. 20 of their 24 amphibious tanks successfully made it to shore, providing crucial fire support for the infantry assault. The Devonshire Regiment and the Dorsetshire Regiment, advancing on a 2-brigade front, found the German resistance fierce but less concentrated than at Omaha. Oberst Fritz Ziegelmann, Chief of Staff of the German 716th Infantry Division, had positioned his forces in a series of fortified villages rather than beach fortifications. La Hamel, defended by elements of the 440th Ost Battalion, former Soviet prisoners of war, pressed into German service, became the scene of house-to-house fighting that would continue throughout the day. The British advance was methodical, reflecting Field Marshal Montgomery's preference for set-piece battles with overwhelming firepower. The Royal Artillery had landed special observation parties with the first wave, and by 9 o'clock, concentrated fire missions were systematically reducing German strong points. The cruiser Ajax, veteran of the River Plate action, walked her 6-inch shells through the village of Arromanches, clearing the way for the advance inland. At Juno Beach, the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division faced perhaps the most complex tactical situation of the day. Major General Rodney Frederick Leopold Keller's men had to assault heavily fortified positions, while simultaneously securing the port facilities at Courseulles-sur-Mer. That would be essential for follow-up operations. The Royal Winnipeg Rifles and the Queen's Own Rifles of Canada spearheaded the assault, supported by Fort Garry horse tanks that had been specially modified for the beach assault. The Canadians discovered that years of coastal raids had taught the Germans to expect precisely the kind of frontal assault they were mounting. Concrete bunkers, sited for interlocking fields of fire, turned the beach approaches into a deadly maze. Lieutenant Colonel John Meredith Roberts, commanding the Queen's Own Rifles, was killed within minutes of landing, but his men continued the advance under the leadership of company officers, who displayed the kind of initiative that higher headquarters had hoped for but could not guarantee. By 10:30, Canadian engineers were clearing lanes through the beach obstacles while fighting continued in the dunes beyond. The German response at Juno was complicated by the presence of Obergefreiter Hans Kiefer's 84th Signal Intercept Company, which had been monitoring Allied radio traffic for months. Kiefer's unit provided early warning of the invasion, but also created confusion by reporting multiple simultaneous landings that overwhelmed the German command structure's ability to respond coherently. Sword Beach presented the most strategically important objectives of the day. The British 3rd Infantry Division, commanded by Major General Thomas Guthrie Rennie, was tasked not only with establishing a beachhead, but with advancing rapidly toward Caen, the communications hub that controlled movement throughout the Normandy Peninsula. The Staffordshire Yeomanry's DD tanks performed better here than anywhere else, with 28 of 34 tanks reaching the beach successfully. The South Lancashire Regiment and the Suffolk Regiment advanced against positions held by the German 716th Regiment, whose commander, Oberst Ludwig Krug, had positioned his men in accordance with Rommel's doctrine of forward defense, but the prize of Caen would prove elusive. The 21st Panzer Division, commanded by General Major Edgar Feuchtiner, finally received permission to counterattack at 3 in the afternoon. Feuchtiner's panzers, supported by assault guns from the 260th Sturmgeschütz Brigade, struck the gap between Juno and Sword Beaches in the war's first major armored clash. In Western Europe since 1940, the Panzer attack, while ultimately unsuccessful, demonstrated that German resistance was far from broken. Captain Hans von Luck, commanding the 1st Battalion, 125th Panzer Grenadier Regiment, led his battle group to within sight of the invasion beaches before being forced back by concentrated anti-tank fire and attacks from rocket-firing Typhoon fighter-bombers. By evening, the British and Canadian forces had achieved most of their D-Day objectives, except the most important one. Caen remained in German hands and would continue to resist for more than a month. The price of this partial success was nearly 3,000 British and Canadian casualties. But unlike Omaha Beach, the eastern landings had proceeded roughly according to plan. While the world's attention focused on the beach landings, the war's largest airborne operation had begun 6 hours earlier in the pre-dawn darkness of June 6th. 23,000 American, British, and Canadian paratroopers and glider-borne troops were scattered across the Norman countryside in an operation that would prove both more successful and more chaotic than anyone had dared predict. Major General Maxwell Davenport Taylor, commanding the 101st Airborne Division, found himself alone in a Norman field at 2:30 in the morning, armed only with his pistol and a cricket clicker used for identification in the darkness. The 43-year-old former West Point superintendent had jumped with the first wave of paratroopers, but his aircraft had been scattered by anti-aircraft fire and cloud cover that reduced visibility to near zero. The scattering of the airborne forces, initially seen as a catastrophe, would prove to be an unexpected advantage. German commanders, receiving reports of paratrooper landings across a front of nearly 50 miles, could not determine where the main Allied effort was concentrated. General Major Wilhelm Falley, commanding the 91st Air Landing Division, was killed while rushing to his command post. His staff car ambushed by paratroopers from the 82nd Airborne Division, who were as surprised by the encounter as the Germans. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Lee Wolverton, commanding the 3rd Battalion, 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, had been killed during the drop when his aircraft was hit by flak over the Cotentin Peninsula. His men, scattered across several square miles of flooded terrain, began the confused process of reorganizing under junior officers who had never expected to command companies or battalions in their first combat operation. The mission of securing the causeways behind Utah Beach fell primarily to the 502nd and 505th Parachute Infantry Regiments. These narrow roads, elevated above the marshes that Rommel had flooded as an anti-airborne measure, were essential for moving troops and supplies inland from the beach. Without them, Utah Beach would become an isolated pocket that could be contained and eventually eliminated. Colonel Howard Ray Johnson, commanding the 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment, faced perhaps the most complex mission of the airborne assault. His men were tasked with securing the town of St. Mary-Église, the first French community to be liberated by Allied forces. The operation became a street-by-street battle as German reserves rushed forward in the confusion of the night drop, contested every building. Private John Malcolm Steele of F Company, 505th Parachute Infantry, became an unwitting symbol of the airborne assault when his parachute caught on the church spire of St. Mary-Église, hanging helplessly as the battle raged below. Steele played dead for 2 hours until German forces withdrew, and American paratroopers cut him down. His ordeal, witnessed by French civilians hiding in their cellars, would be remembered long after. The strategic significance of the airborne operations had been analyzed and filed away. The British airborne effort, while smaller in scale, achieved more precise objectives. Major General Richard Nelson Gale's 6th Airborne Division was tasked with securing the left flank of the invasion beaches by capturing key bridges over the River Orne and the Caen Canal. The operation began with a coup de main assault by D Company, 2nd Battalion, Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry, commanded by Major John Howard. Howard's glider-borne force of 180 men achieved complete tactical surprise, landing within yards of their objectives at 23 minutes past midnight. The capture of what would become known as Pegasus Bridge and Horsa Bridge was accomplished within 10 minutes, but holding them against German counterattacks would require the arrival of follow-up forces that were scattered across the Norman countryside. The German response to the airborne landings revealed the weakness of their defensive strategy. The 7th Army, commanded by General Oberst Friedrich Dahlmann, had prepared for a conventional amphibious assault but had no coherent plan for dealing with large-scale airborne operations behind their coastal defenses. Units were committed piecemeal as local commanders attempted to deal with threats in their immediate sectors, preventing any coordinated response to the overall Allied strategy. By dawn, the airborne forces had achieved their primary mission despite suffering casualty rates approaching 25% in some units. The causeways behind Utah Beach were secure, St. Mary-Église was in American hands, and the critical bridges east of Caen remained under British control. More importantly, the confusion created by 23,000 Allied soldiers scattered across Normandy had paralyzed German decision-making at the precise moment where rapid response might have contained the invasion. As the sun set on June 6, 1944, the greatest gamble in military history had succeeded beyond the most optimistic Allied projections. From Utah Beach in the west to Sword Beach in the east, 156,000 Allied soldiers had established themselves on Hitler's fortress Europe, backed by a logistical network that was already delivering the supplies needed to expand and consolidate their precarious foothold. General Eisenhower, who had carried in his pocket a prepared statement accepting responsibility for the invasion's failure, instead found himself drafting victory communiques. The Supreme Allied Commander's laconic announcement, Allied naval forces, supported by strong air forces, began landing Allied armies this morning on the northern coast of France, understated what historians would later recognize as the turning point of the Second World War in Europe. The human cost had been enormous but sustainable. Allied casualties for D-Day totaled approximately 10,400 men killed, wounded, and missing, with the heaviest losses concentrated at Omaha Beach. The German casualties were harder to calculate, but certainly exceeded 4,000, including many of the experienced NCOs and junior officers, whose leadership had made the Atlantic Wall defenses effective. What could not be measured in casualty statistics was the psychological impact of the successful invasion. German morale, sustained for years by propaganda promising that the Atlantic Wall was impregnable, cracked as reports filtered back from the front. Obergefreiter Franz Gockel of the 716th Infantry Division wrote in his diary, "The Amos and Tommies are everywhere. Our officers tell us to hold fast, but what can we hold with? The French civilian population, brutalized by 4 years of occupation, began to believe that liberation was possible." Marie-Louise Osment, a schoolteacher in the village of Perrier-sur-Ladan, recorded in her diary, "We can hear the guns all day now. The Germans are nervous, shouting at each other in their harsh language, but there is something different in the air, hope, perhaps, or maybe just the smell of freedom carried on the wind from the beaches." Field Marshal Rommel, racing back from Germany when news of the invasion reached him, arrived at his headquarters at La Roche-Guyon to find his carefully prepared defenses penetrated at multiple points. The Desert Fox, who had never lost a major engagement in North Africa, surveyed the situation with the tactical acumen that had made him legendary. His assessment was brutally realistic. Without immediate reinforcement from the panzer reserves held in central France, the Atlantic Wall could not hold. But those reserves remained frozen by Hitler's insistence on personal control over strategic decisions. The 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend and Panzer Lehr Division, the two most powerful armored formations in France, sat motionless in their assembly areas while the Führer debated whether the Normandy landings were the main invasion or merely a diversion preceding the real assault at Pas-d-Calais. The success of Operation Fortitude, the deception plan that had convinced German intelligence that General Patton was preparing to lead the main invasion across the narrowest part of the English Channel, continued to pay dividends even after the Normandy landings had begun. The German 15th Army, comprising 19 divisions, remained deployed opposite Dover, while events in Normandy determined the fate of Nazi Europe. As darkness fell on the Norman coast, advanced elements of the British Second Army were digging in less than 10 miles from Caen, while American forces had secured a continuous beachhead stretching nearly 25 miles along the coast. The port facilities at Romanches were already being prepared for the artificial harbors, the mulberries, that would provide the logistical foundation for the liberation of Western Europe. The longest day had ended, but the longest campaign was just beginning. The success of D-Day had opened the second front that Stalin had demanded for 3 years. but transforming the narrow coastal foothold into a base for the liberation of France would require months of grinding warfare that would test the resolve of soldiers and civilians alike. General Bradley, surveying the Omaha Beach sector as the last light faded from the Norman sky, reflected on the price of victory. "We had torn a hole in Hitler's Atlantic wall," he would later write, "but it remained to be seen whether we could hold it long enough to pour through the armies that would carry us to Berlin." The battle for Normandy and the fate of Nazi Germany would be decided in the fields and hedgerows of France over the 90 days that followed the triumph of D-Day. The real story behind the Allied D-Day invasion was not just one of meticulous planning and technological superiority, but of ordinary men rising to extraordinary circumstances when the fate of civilization hung in the balance. June 6, 1944 would be remembered not just as the longest day, but as the day when the tide of the Second World War turned decisively toward Allied victory and the liberation of Europe.